fantasy. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you a double review video of two new-ish SFF releases. Both of these were January releases. I read both of these in January. I've mentioned them in wrap-ups, but this is going to be an in-depth double review video. Besides being SFF, they have very little in common except that they both have blue covers. So the first is going to be The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. I got this arc from the bookstore where I volunteer. This is historical fantasy. And the second is going to be Binti Home by Nnedi Okorafor. This is the second in a sci-fi novella trilogy, and I actually won this arc in a Goodreads giveaway. So I'm going to start with The Bear and the Nightingale. As I mentioned, this is a historical fantasy novel. It's set in a small community in northern Rus or Russia, in what I think is the 14th century. It utilizes stories, characters, and creatures from Russian folklore, but as far as I can tell, this is an original story and not a retelling of a specific fairy tale. It starts with the birth of the protagonist, Vasilisa, Vasya for short, and with the death of her mother. Her grandmother, her mother's mother, had been known for her mysterious origins and her uncanny qualities. And Marina Ivanova, Vasya's mother, knows when she's pregnant that her youngest daughter will be the heir to these magical gifts. So as predicted, Vasya grows into an untamed girl with an air of magic about her. But eventually Vasya's father remarries a woman from court, and this evil stepmother character has her own compelling storyline as well. It turns out that Anna Ivanova can see the same house and wood spirits that Vasya has grown up with as her friends, but she believes that they are demons, and she believes and has been told that she is mad, and she is married off unwillingly into this marriage. She had wanted to join a convent because she believed that the demons couldn't get to her there. Instead, she finds herself far from court, stepmother to a girl who seems to her to be a witch. Into this mix, we get a self-aggrandizing priest who comes to the village, and things become perilous indeed for wild young Vasya. So the main plot itself involves a struggle between powerful forces that sweep Vasya up and threaten her community, and the lengths to which she has to go to restore order and balance. But the details of that storyline actually, after this much time, have stuck with me a whole lot less than the atmosphere of this book. It's an atmosphere of brutal winter and encroaching dark magic with a hint of whimsy. There's a lot that's thematically familiar to me in this story as a frequent reader of historical fantasy set in the Middle Ages. For example, folk beliefs versus the coming of Christianity, women's really brutal lot in life, witchcraft, etc. And I don't think The Bear and the Nightingale really breaks any new ground in this regard. But what was new and unfamiliar to me was the Russian setting. I don't think I've ever read a book that takes place in medieval Russia before. I didn't know much about it, and I enjoyed learning some things about the history here. So apparently at this time, Russia wasn't a country yet. Russian in this book refers to people who are culturally Russian, not nationally Russian. The grand princes of the region were actually under the authority of the Mongols, which I did not know. You learn something new every day. So this book has attracted a lot of comparisons to Uprooted by Naomi Novik, and I want to address that comparison and note some of the similarities and differences that I see. I think it's a fair comparison in terms of the fact that they both have some Slavic fairy tale origins. They're both set in rural communities, and they both have teenage female protagonists who share some strong character traits. I think if you liked Agnieszka in Uprooted, I think it's also likely that you will like Vasya in this book as well. But while I felt that Uprooted was actually a pretty formulaic fantasy novel with some fairy tale trappings, The Bear and the Nightingale feels a whole lot to me more like a genuine dark adult fairy tale in novel form with some slower pacing. I think it's a book that takes care to remind us that it is more of a curse than a blessing to be something out of a fairy tale. It's definitely a book to curl up with a hot mug of tea on a cold winter night and be grateful that your life is untouched by perilous magic, and also that you don't live in remote medieval Russia where everything is cold. Also, this book has no romance storyline, so I think that combined with the slower pacing will mean that this won't have as much YA crossover appeal as Uprooted did, even though it does have a teenage protagonist. But I think that readers looking for grown-up fairy tale stories will find this possibly more rewarding. Unfortunately for such a slow, lush, and atmospheric book, the ending felt really rushed for me. So it left me a little less emotionally moved than I would have hoped for. That's the only really clear fault I can find with this novel, which I think is really impressive for a debut. I did not know when I was reading this, but I know now that this is actually meant to be the first in a series. I don't think it feels necessarily like it has to be the first book in a series. It stands alone perfectly well. There are some characters that you want to know more about, and you, at the end of this book, I think you want to know what's going to happen to Vasya in her life. So there's definitely an opening for some interesting things to happen in the next book, or books, as the case may be. But it's not the type of series starter that's going to leave you hanging at the end of the first book. I gave this book a 4 out of 5 star rating, and I can think of a lot of friends I have to whom I would recommend this. My second review of the day, Binti Home by Nnedi Okorafor, really is a book in a series. It is a middle book in a novella trilogy. So this one doesn't really stand on its own, and because this is a sequel, this review may contain mild spoilers for the first novella, Binti, although I'm not going to be discussing the plot of Binti in any great detail. Because this is a much shorter book, I think this is also going to be a much shorter review. So the Binti novellas are a sci-fi novella series that I believe the author considers to be Afrofuturism, which is a term that I've heard bandied around quite a bit, but which I'm a little unclear on the exact definition of. I think it can be a little nebulous, but what I gather is that that means that it is sci-fi that is based on African culture. Nnedi Okorafor is a Nigerian-American author, and African identity is a huge element in her work. This series of novellas follows a mathematically gifted young woman named Binti who leaves her home and her traditional minority Himba tribe to attend an interstellar university called Umza University. The first novella in this series, Binti, was the first book by Nnedi Okorafor I read. I liked it quite a lot. I wasn't blown away by it like some people were. After Binti, I read Lagoon by the same author, which I felt so-so about. I gave Binti 4 stars, and I gave Lagoon 3 stars. I'm going to be honest with you right at the start here. I loved Binti Home, and this was a 5-star read for me. I'd say that the first book impressed me on an intellectual level, but Binti Home moved me emotionally in a way that the first book didn't. Binti packed a lot into a deceptively simple adventure story. Binti Home, on the other hand, is longer and more character-driven, which is a storytelling style that appeals to me more. This book follows what happens when Binti goes home to visit her Himba family, changed as she is by the events of the first book, and accompanied by her Medusa friend Okwu. It also gives us an expanded view of Binti's world, which I think a lot of us wanted after the first novella. In this book, Binti is struggling with PTSD, and also with a sense of anger that she feels makes her unclean. She thinks that going on a traditional pilgrimage is going to help her, but that means she has to face all of the ways in which her decision to leave home has ostracized her from the life she might have had with her traditionalist family. And what's really interesting to me here is that while in the first book, Binti survived on the strength of her Himba identity, in this book she's forced to actually confront and accept the parts of her identity that aren't Himba. Along the way, we learn more about the various people of Binti's world and about the strange and incredible technologies that they work with. We also learn of another ethnic group that the Himba look down upon in rather the same way that the majority Kush look down upon the Himba. And it's interesting to see Binti face some of her own prejudices. I want to mention that there were certain passages in this book, certain scenes, that just took my breath away with how beautifully they were written in a way that didn't happen to me with anything in the first book. I particularly remember a scene in which Okwu encounters a body of water on Earth for the first time that's just absolutely stunning and touching, as well as a couple other scenes that I'm not going to talk about because spoilers. For those who care, I should mention that this installment of this series does end on a cliffhanger. So if that's something that bothers you, you might want to wait until the third book is released to read books 2 and 3 back to back. I generally don't mind being left hanging, I'm discovering as I read more and more series, but I will certainly be hotly anticipating the finale of this trilogy. So those were my reviews of 2 blue books, both of which I highly recommend for different reasons. Let me know if you've read either of these, if you're planning on reading them, what you think. That is all. Bye for now.